This is FRM Part 1, Book 4, Valuation and Risk Management, and the chapter on external and internal ratings. The good news for you guys is that we talked about this in the previous chapter, so you have a good sense of the ratings and the ratings agencies. We're just going to add a little bit to this chapter. It's a relatively short slide deck. It's almost entirely descriptive in nature, but just remember what we're trying to do here. We're trying to evaluate the probability of default of a particular bond issue. And what we're going to do is extend that into, kind of a self-analysis of credit risk when we get later on into the learning objectives. So we're going to do description of some external rating scales, the ratings process, the link between ratings and default. And of course, we need to talk about time and economic cycles, potential impact of rating changes on bond and stock prices. Of course, that's an important part. Compare external and internal ratings approaches, and then take a look at banks, how they internally rate through the cycle or at the point. We'll look at a transition matrix, and then we'll look at some processes and some biases in the last slide or two. Now, of course, what these ratings agencies do, like S&P, like Moody's, like Fitch, and there's a bunch of other ones out there as well. What they do is they try to present a relatively easy scale for regular old investors and individuals to read and understand. And so what could be easier than having the highest rating as a AAA? It's a AAA rating. That means that this particular issue has a very small probability of default, all the way down to a C-rated bond, which is the lowest that you can go without being in default. Remember, the lowest is a rating of D, which stands for default. And of course, it's not just A, B, and C. There are different levels inside of each of those. So AAA and AA and so on and so forth. So as we move down, that arrow suggests, as we move down, we move from an area in which there is very little default risk all the way down to the bottom where there is substantial default risk. And of course, the important part of this is the default risk is going to determine the yield to maturity on the bond. And that yield to maturity on the bond is then going to determine the price of a bond. So of course, the ratings give us a sense of what that credit risk is, what that default risk is, and that's going to help us as bondholders. That's going to help us as financial risk managers to price fixed income securities. Now, of course, the ratings has a process. You start at the beginning and then you end up somewhere with a publication of the rating. And remember what I said to you in the last chapter. Let me go ahead and just repeat it very quickly. That if we're looking at a bond and the total amount of debt from this company is this much, and the business is able to generate this much in annual operating cash flow, that sounds to me like a AAA rated bond, very little chance of default. So the rating process is really a system of figuring out how much is this versus how much is this. So how do we do this? We do a qualitative analysis of the company. So assessments of the quality of management and the competitive aspects. My undergraduate students in almost all of their business classes have to do some kind of a SWOT analysis, the strengths and the weaknesses and the opportunities and the threats. And that's kind of what this qualitative analysis is. And then, of course, you ramp that up to a quantitative analysis. And this is what I teach my finance students, is to be able to look at financial statements and then not only compute the ratios, all of the important financial ratios, but then compare those ratios to the trend and then compare those ratios to the macro environment, to our most closest competitors. All right, so then you meet with the firm's management, and then the meeting with the rating agency committee, and then a notification is sent to the rated firm detailing the assigned rating, and then those managers, they can they can call the ratings agency back and say, whoa, wait a minute, did you look at this? Did you look at this? Did you look at this? And then the rating is published. Now, of course, this process is not going to occur over a one-day period. This takes some time. And essentially what happens is that the ratings agencies, they become, pretty familiar with the company. And so they know the company, they know the leaders, they talk to the people on this side of the supply chain, they talk to people on that side of the supply chain, and they evaluate the probability of default qualitatively and quantitatively. So as I tell my students, this is a great career to pursue. You get a chance to combine science with art. And it's really a fascinating way to do the science. So you can do all the math, all the stuff that we've done, like value at risk, and Black-Scholes Merton option pricing model. You can do all that kind of science, and then you have to put it into a bucket in which you're going to use your own judgment. And there's the artistry that's involved. And so it really appeals to individuals who have both sets of skill, and it requires both skill sets. How about impacts on external ratings? Excuse me. Let's talk about time horizon here for just a second. Probability of default. At any given rating, at the beginning of a cycle increases with the time horizon. I mean, that should make perfect sense. Investment grade bonds, those that are BBB or higher, those are fairly protected, and we'll see that in a later slide. But non-investment grade bonds, sometimes they're called speculative grade bonds, sometimes they're called junk bonds. The chapter calls them non-investment grade bonds. Those suffer the worst yield changes and the worst price drops. Of course, we spent some good time talking about the economic cycle. And this is important. The economy, sometimes it can expand, sometimes it contracts. And so those ratings by the agencies are determined, at least in part, if not largely, due to the current state of the dynamic economy. Because look, if the economy is growing like this, right? What that means is that each of these firms are able to find positive net present value projects. And so that increases the probability that the firm is going to be able to repay the debt. Now remember, if I go back here just kind of quickly, what Moody's and S&P and Fitch do is that they assign this rating for all firms across all industries. So the question then becomes, does a AA rated bond in one industry, is that equal a AA rating for a bond in a different industry? And so this is important here. Notice that first block point I have. So two firms in different industries could have identical ratings. What did I just say? AA. But the probability of default may be higher for one firm or the other. And so what that means is that not only as good financial risk managers are we required to understand the whole process that the ratings agencies pursue in order to come up with this final rating, but we also need to just distinguish and differentiate between and among different industries. How about the impact of ratings changes on bond and stock prices? Of course, if default risk changes, well, that then necessarily changes the yield to maturity on a bond and the bond price. And so think about the right-hand side of the balance sheet. If we're doing market values over there, then if there's a downgrade, then the bond values, total bond value goes down. Well, the shareholders who are down here on the bottom right, they're looking up to the bondholders and they're seeing increases in default risk. Well, if the bondholders then have a greater risk of not receiving their coupon or interest payments, then the shareholders are looking up and they say to themselves something like, wow, if they may not get their interest payments, maybe we won't get our dividend payments. So then both groups, the bondholders here and the shareholders here, then they both look over to the left, over at those long-term assets, and they say, wait a minute, What are those long-term assets doing? The executives promised us they had a positive net present value. If there's a downgrade, that must mean those assets are not performing as they were originally expected. All right, so let's go through these points here. Overwhelming evidence that a rating downgrade triggers a decrease in bond pricing. That makes perfect sense. Rating upgrade triggers an increase in bond prices. Although there's much less evidence to support this conclusion than the original conclusion about a downgrade, and this has everything to do with the asymmetry, and we've talked about this in previous chapters, that the market doesn't view good news with the exact same magnitude that it views bad news. You know, when there's bad news, prices fall. When there's good news, prices rise, but they might not rise to that same level of magnitude just because shareholders and bondholders tend to be less than perfectly optimistic. How about shares of stocks? I mean, clearly, if there's more risk on the top right-hand side of the balance sheet, there's probably more risk on the bottom right-hand side of the balance sheet. So note, there's moderate evidence to support that a rating downgrade will lead to a stock price decrease. However, it's much more complex than that, and it has everything to do with how the bondholders and the shareholders, let me do it like this, are on the bottom right, the right-hand side of the balance sheet, looking over to the performance of those long-term assets. And it's really a sense of having trust in the executives over the long term. You know, remember, those bondholders are promised that coupon payment, and those things occur every 6 months. I mean, the shareholders, if there is a dividend payment, typically get dividends every 3 months. But remember, those dividends are generally smoothed. So the performance of the assets over here is going to go like this, right? Cash flows go up and down, but the dividends tend to be smooth. And so the relationship between the bond rating and stock pricing is way more complex than what it is with bond prices. Now, there are external ratings agencies, which is what we've talked about, but there are internal ways to do this as well. Remember, the external ratings agencies are supposed to be independent ratings agencies. But you guys know this, over the last 10 or 20 or 30 years, there's been, a change in the regulatory process, especially in the financial services industry. And so because banks have these capital requirements, that they are now allowed and in fact encouraged to perform their own internal approach. And so this is an internal ratings approach. And so what they're doing is they're self-evaluating not only the performance of those assets on the left-hand side of the balance sheet, but they're also evaluating, what's known as third-party risk. Financial institutions, they have positions in lots of derivative contracts like futures contracts or option contracts or swap contracts or credit default swap contracts. And so part of this internal ratings approach is to self-evaluate, but also in that self-evaluation to look over there at the counterparty and say, okay, what is the chance that that dude over there is not going to pay me what he owes me in my credit default swap position? And so the internal ratings approach is really a result of, failures systematically over time in terms of risk management processes. And so it's better for financial institutions to kind of take possession of it themselves, take ownership of it. And of course, this all came out from the enforcements of capital requirements. I said that just a few minutes ago, of the Basel II. All right, so what financial institutions do is twofold. What they do, and you can imagine that this to be the case, you would probably come up with the same idea. Let's go ahead and evaluate our current state. What is the current level of our default risk? And then what is our level of default risk over time? And so this is the difference between at the point internal ratings, sometimes called point in time, evaluate the current situation by taking into account both cyclical, so we got to worry about this, plus the permanent effects. So we do this quantitatively and qualitatively, and we're really going to do this for, just the short term, maybe extending it into the medium term. But through the cycle, what we're trying to do is identify what that permanent component of default risk is. That permanent component is much more stable over time, because if you look at the left-hand side of the balance sheet, those performing assets, those performing long-term assets, they tend to be more stable over time and have lower volatility. All right, here's a table that I promised you a little bit earlier. Notice the matrix here. We have the initial rating going down the left-hand column, and then we have the rating 1 year later going along the first row. All right, so this matrix gives us the probability of a firm ending up in a certain point given a specific starting point. Okay, this is called a transition matrix. So I highlighted one there. Let's go ahead and look at the BB rated bond. So I've got the red over there, and then BB across the top. So can I just round 80.53? Let me just round to 80% there. So what that means that if we start out with a BB rating at the beginning of the year, we have an 80% chance of maintaining that rating by the end of the year. And then let me round again, going up or down. And so look, we have an 80% chance of staying where we are, but we have about an 8 or 9% chance of being downgraded to B, and we have about an 8% chance of being upgraded to BB. And so that's how you read this matrix. But there's a couple of cool things along this. Go all the way up to the top left, that northwest corner. If you're AAA at the beginning of the year, you have a 90% chance of being AAA at the end of the year and an 8% chance. So, keep going, small, small, small. You have no chance of default. So look at AAA and AA rated bonds have no chance of default by the end of the year. But even going down to BBB, which is the investment grade cutoff, right? BBB and above are investment grade. You have a 0.18% chance of defaulting in that current year. So that's why these are known as investment graded bonds, not only because, what did I do before? Here's the size of the bond issue. Here's the size of the operating cash flow. But clearly, those kinds of companies are not going to default in that first year. But then look all the way down to the bottom. If you start out as CCC, you have 60-some% chance of remaining there, but a 20% chance of defaulting. And so you see that this is not a linear relationship going down. Oh my gosh, I don't even know what kind of relationship that is, but it's clearly has some exponent in it, maybe some crazy exponent. All right, let's do just a quick example here. So here in that top table, I have some percentages, and I just go from A to B to CCC, and I ignore all those other ones in here. Like this table goes through all of them. This one here just chops it into fewer discrete intervals. So this is a 1-year transition matrix. So determine the probability that a B-rated firm or bond will default over a 2-year period. So what we're going to do at the bottom table, we're going to figure out all of the different paths. So we can go from B and jump to default. So that gets us to 5%, right? Then we could go from B, we could be upgraded, and then we could be downgraded, but that's going to be a 0%, right? If we go up to A, we have a 0% there. But then if we go from B and stay at B, and then we go to a default, that's going to be 5% times the 85%. And then if we go from B down to CCC and then to default, that's going to be the 5% times the 20%. So you just sum those. You get the 5, the 4 1/4, and the 1. And so what were we trying to do? The probability that a B-rated bond or firm will default over the next 2 years is 10 1/4%. How about that learning objective on building and calibrating and backtesting an internal rating system? All right, so just think about this. We need to build this system. So what are we going to try to do? Well, we're going to try to say, you know what, we don't want to really reinvent the wheel. We know how the ratings agencies do this. Let's go ahead and take their methods and refine them and refine them to what's unique about our industry, what's unique about our financial institution. And so those weights are going to be attached to financial ratios or risk factors depending on our current system, right? Calibrating involves establishing a link between the internal rating scales and those tables displaying the cumulative probabilities of default. And so we can do this from 1 all the way out to 30. And so when we're calibrating, what we're going to try to do is make sure that our methodology then calibrates with what we know to be observed behavior and observed changes in default risk. And then, of course, we need to go back and say, all right, here's our model. Let's go back and test it and see what happened. And, I'm never really a big fan of trying to pick a certain time frame. There's always a time bias if you say 5 years or 10 years. But the chapter says going back somewhere between 11 and 18 years is sufficient to test the validity of those ratings. But once again, this backtesting probably has as much to do with the artistry of, trying to figure out, what is important about the last 11 or 18 years and how much of that is relevant to today. I mean, that's really an artistry kind of an interpretation of history. How about some biases that can affect a rating system? So, of course, we've got all sorts of biases. There are behavioral issues that influence our daily decisions, and then, of course, they influence our professional decisions. And so these are relatively straightforward. So a time horizon bias, depending on how much weight we're using for that at the point, versus the through the cycle, when we're trying to get a big picture of this. And so there can be a bias. We can say something like, hey, you know what? Today is more important than next year. That would be an example of a time horizon bias. Information bias, suppose we don't have accurate information, suppose we don't have complete information, suppose we don't have sufficient information. Homogeneity bias, the inability to maintain consistent rating methods. So over time, what we need to do is just be consistent. The homogeneity as opposed to heterogeneity means that we're trying to be stable and consistent. Principal agent bias, this is the classic example of you hire somebody to do something for you. Are they going to behave in your best interest or their best interest? And so we've got to worry about this principal agent bias. Backtesting has everything to do with incorrectly linking what the rating system produces in terms of a rating to default rates. We always have to make assumptions about the distributions, and so modeling the probability of default using some crazy distribution called Jim's distribution is probably not appropriate. Normal distribution, who knows? That's what we need to kind of figure out. And then scaling is an issue too. And that takes us through our external and internal ratings chapter.